rotate the hip back, you sort of sink like this.
Yeah.
So that's why if you're sitting on more cushions, that sort of more naturally happens.
And to lean on the legs a little bit.
Yeah, so because if the legs are up, then that's sort of there. So if you have them down and you sit more cushions, then that will push it up, and then that will, I think, naturally rotate a bit forward.
You can return to the sixth, in the middle there, you know.
This?
And a few words.
About which one?
All of them.
Okay.
Yeah.
So these were what's called the 6 preconditions or prerequisites. These are normally presented in the meditation text in the context of doing a Shamatha retreat, a longer one. What sort of conditions do we need to set up to be able to do a longer Shamatha retreat well? The first one was the outer conditions, how to set up the outer conditions well. And we saw there a couple of important ones is to have a few like-minded people around and then be in a very quiet place. And these are all inner conditions. And 2 and 3, few desires and being content, was about material possessions, to not be wanting a lot of material things and be content with what we have now. And then few activities was to simplify our life, not to be too busy doing too many things. And then ethical discipline, of course, is just to have a basis of ethics, avoiding harmful behaviour. And then this 6th one was to let go of a lot of obsessive compulsive thinking that often dominates our mind, because that will interfere, of course, with our retreat.
Relaxing and shifting. Relaxing and shifting in the 6th.
The 6th one is really just to, when we notice it, just let it go, let it go, let it go. But what I mentioned here was what's going to be very helpful is if we can work on shifting our worldview, because often we have a lot of compulsive thinking about the things out there. You know, how can I get those things that I seem like I really need, and how can I avoid those things, and a lot of thinking about this. So it's going to be helpful here to, if we shift that worldview to the source of happiness and suffering is within, then we can more easily let go a lot of that obsessive compulsive thinking.
What are the opinions, I guess, on whether reading is good or bad on retreat?
On retreat, yeah. I mean, it depends what sort of retreat you're doing, whether reading is good or not. But I mean, in general, of course, in retreat we're trying to internalize. So I think it's not good to do like lots of reading, because that's going to stimulate the mind. Rather, I think in a retreat it's helpful to do 2 types of reading. One, to read things that are directly relevant to the practice we're doing to improve our understanding of the practices we're doing. And the second type of reading that can be helpful from time to time is to read something that's inspirational, to inspire us. I mean, a general inspirational, particularly about practice and so forth. So I think those 2 sorts of reading can be helpful, but not to do too much.
In the more advanced states of shamatha, when you practice, is it a state where you identify the thought before it rises up? And what is that? Is it chemistry? Is it impulse?
I mean, what I was mentioning before was, now as a beginner, we only notice a thought when we're already gone for a long time. And then if we improve, we'll notice as we're going, and then we'll start to be able to watch it sort of after it's arisen, and then we'll be able to see it as it's arising, and then we'll sort of notice something just before it arises.
What is that something?
That is the very subtle level of activity that precedes the thought. So we notice some activity that then becomes the thought. So that is very subtle.
Is it an impulse in the consciousness?
Yeah, it's mental activity, but very subtle.
I'd like to speak a little bit about heat.
Heat, yeah.
Yeah, in meditation.
Sure.
Because I know in Indian mythology, Parvati and Shiva, they sit meditation and they got a lot of tapas. Tapas, it's a lot of heat, and this hot, it's make the tissue, it's make it subtle. It's warm the tissue and make it subtle. So I wonder if there is something with the Buddhism that's connected to this.
Sure. In this shamatha practice, as I mentioned, when the mind starts to calm down, then the subtle energies in the body start to balance, and that balancing can cause all sorts of sensations in the body, including, very common, a lot of heat, particularly in the chest area. So that's one thing. But in tantric practice, when we're really directly working with the subtle energies, so this heat in shamatha is just a side effect. We're not directly working with subtle energies, we're working with the mind, balancing the mind, and that balancing has that side effect of subtle energies balancing. But in tantric practice, particularly in what's called completion stage practice in tantra, we are directly working with subtle energies. And one of the practices that's quite common in Tibetan Buddhism is called tumo, inner heat. And it often involves focusing at the sort of navel chakra and doing a certain practice that generates heat. And the reason for generating heat is to what's called melt the drops, figuratively. But basically that causes a very blissful experience to arise in the body. And the reason for generating that bliss is not just to have some bliss, but with that blissful mind, our mind becomes crystal clear and focused, and we use that in our Vipassana practice. And so they've done some experiments on Tibetan yogis, and part of their training is, they sit in the snow and have a wet blanket and they have steam coming off their body because they can generate this inner heat. But that's a very high level practice.
That's right.
Not so easy.
To release what? The heat is releasing the imprints?
No, it's just working with the subtle energies, and you're actually generating bodily heat.
For?
Well, in the tumo practice, it's to what's called melt the drops.
What drops?
And it's very complicated, but it's basically to do with central channel, and it basically just causes a lot of bliss in the mind. This melting, the drops is like a sort of figurative term, and that when you melt the drops, then that causes a lot of bliss in the mind, and that makes the mind really vivid, clear, and focused. And then we use that in realizing nature of mind. Okay, let's go back here, and I want to briefly look again at the two main shamatha models that we've been looking at. So remember, the word shamatha is a Sanskrit term. And shamatha is a particular level of concentration we're cultivating. And so remember, shama meant calm, a mind that's calm, not discursive. And ta means to remain or abide, so often translated as abiding. So not only a mind that is calm, but it's abiding single-pointedly on the object. So in these two shamatha models, this 9-stage model here, and then that 4-stage model including the waterfall and so forth, these are describing the stages of progress of shamatha from sort of two slightly different perspectives. This one is from the perspective of the mind, and it's in terms of the mind abiding better and better on the object. And so here, that's relating to this part of shamatha. So here, oh, that's not on the mind, that's the mind perspective. In terms of the mind abiding better and better on the object. So then we have, then the model here, these 9 stages are called the 9 mental abidings. So abide means to be focused on, to remain on. Whereas when we are using the mind as the object, we have more the event perspective. How are the events unfolding in the mind? And so this is much more about the calm aspect. And so here we have that 4-stage model. In that 4-stage model, the events are, the thoughts are like a waterfall of thoughts crashing down on us. And then if we keep watching, it becomes a fast-flowing river of thoughts, slowly becoming a slow-moving river of thoughts, emptying into a still lake, i.e. the mind is completely calm. So when we're using this model, it's more from the event perspective. How are the events unfolding in the mind? Whereas when we're using the breath as the object, it's more the mind perspective, the mind abiding better and better on the object. So just because the breath and the mind have sort of 2 different ways of seeing progress, we have these sort of 2 models here. And in this chart, there's sort of there's a sort of an attempt to correlate them. So I'd just like to briefly look at this chart on page 3, because we can sort of go through those 9 stages briefly again and look at the correlation to this 4-stage model that we looked at. So if we go back to the top of page 2, it said shamatha is attained by progressing through the 9 stages, relying on the 8 antidotes to abandon the 5 faults. This is accomplished through the 6 powers and the 4 mental engagements. So again, if we apply those 8 antidotes to those 5 faults, we move along those the 9 stages to shamatha. So let's briefly look at these 9 stages in chart on page 3. So we see at stage 1 called directed attention, and then the second column says what is achieved. What do we achieve at the first stage of progress? It says one is able to direct the attention to the chosen object. So if we can simply focus on the object for a second or 2, we're at stage 1. But what problems still persist is in the third column. There is no attentional continuity on the object, meaning we can't remain on the object. We're just there a few seconds and we're completely distracted most of the time. And the attentional imbalance, it says coarse excitation. So coarse excitation is when we're completely distracted. So that's the main imbalance. And it says the type of mental engagement is focused. That means that when we want to attend to the object, we have to put a lot of effort to just focus on the object at all. The quality of experience is movement, meaning there's a lot of things going on in the mind, And we can see in the last column that's sort of similar to the waterfall experience. Then if we go to stage 2, continuous attention, what we achieve is what we didn't have in the first one, and that is attentional continuity on the chosen object for up to a minute. So we didn't have that at the first stage, now we've got that. We can hold the object up to a minute or two. So what's the problem here? Problems that persist is that still most of the time we're distracted. So still, again, intentional imbalance, coarse excitation means we're distracted a lot. And again, mental engagement, focused, meaning we're having a lot of effort just to stay a little bit focused. Again, still a lot of movement and waterfall of thoughts still. Then we go to stage 3. So now we've overcome the fault at stage 2 where we're distracted most of the time, because at stage 3 we have swift recovery from distracted attention, mostly on the object. So now we're not distracted for long periods of time, we quickly come back to the object. So what's the problem that still persists at stage 3 is that one still forgets the object entirely for brief periods. So we're still losing the object for brief periods. So again, we still have complete distraction sometimes, but now at stage 3 it's not focused engagement but what's called interrupted, meaning the difference is at stage 1 and 2 we are mostly distracted and only a little bit on the object, but now we're mostly on the object and only a little bit interrupted from our focus. So that's why it's called interrupted engagement. We're mostly on the object and only a little bit now and again are we interrupted in our focus, but still a lot of thoughts going on, a lot of movement, so still like a waterfall of thoughts. So then of course at stage 4 we have improved, so we now don't get distracted ever completely. So it says here, one no longer completely forgets the chosen object, but what's the fault that still persists, or the problem still persists at stage 4, is there's some degree of complacency concerning samadhi. So even though we're holding the object well, we're still a little bit complacent in the practice. But now the attentional imbalance is not coarse excitation, because coarse excitation is when we completely lose the object, so we don't do that, but we have coarse laxity, medium excitation. So medium excitation, again, is when your mind can be mostly on something else but still a little bit on the object. And then again, our focus is still interrupted, it's still fragmented, but now instead of a lot of movement, what we notice now, the quality of our experience is one of achievement. So by stage 4, we have a sense that we are no longer really a beginner in shamatha. We're really starting to achieve something in our practice. And then instead of a waterfall of thoughts now, it's more like a fast-flowing river of thoughts. So then at stage 5, we've overcome that complacency. Now at stage 5, what we achieve is we take a lot of satisfaction in the practice. But still, what problems persist is still a little bit of resistance. There's still some resistance there. And now we still have that medium excitation, so the engagement is still interrupted. Again, still that quality of experience is a sense of achievement, and still this sort of experience of the fast-flowing river of thoughts. Then, when we get to stage 6, now we don't have any resistance in the training. So there's no resistance in training the attention. We don't have that in our practice now. But now there are some, stage 6 is well known for a lot of things coming up. And so here we see what problems persist: desire, depression, lethargy, drowsiness. These are still there and causing a little bit of a problem. And so now we have, instead of medium excitation, subtle excitation. Now it means that we're mainly on the object and a little bit of background noise going on. And still, of course, our attention is still interrupted by that. again, still a sense of achievement. And now at stage 6, now the amount of mental content of thoughts is really settling down. So now it's much more like a slow-moving river of thoughts in the mind. And then at stage 7, now we have really pacified attachment, depression, lethargy, and drowsiness, and so forth. They don't really cause any problems anymore in our practice. And what problems still persist is there's still a little bit of subtle agitation, subtle dullness happening in the practice. And now at the level of laxity is less, that we only have really some subtle laxity now. And still, though, because of that, there's still a little slight interruption in our attention. Again, but now at stage 7, instead of the quality of our experience is not one of achievement, but now familiarity, that we really are becoming very, very familiar with the object and very familiar with the practice. And again, it's just there at this stage, at stage 7, there's still a little bit of mental content going on, but very slow, like a slow-moving river. And then at stage 8, now we have no subtle laxity, subtle excitation happening. But still, what problem persists is still we need a little bit of effort to ward that off. And even though we don't have any hint of subtle agitation, subtle dullness, it says here, latent impulses are still there, meaning if we stop practice, they'll start to reappear. And now, for the very first time, our attention on the object is not interrupted by any agitation or dullness whatsoever. And now, because of that, our mind has gone completely still, and so there's a quality of stillness. And it's here like the mind is calm like an ocean, without waves. So at stage 9 now, what we achieve is that we can do it effortlessly. The whole practice comes effortless. But what problems persist is that these attentional imbalances may occur in the future. Again, if we stop practicing, it's not irreversible. The intentional, and then the type of engagement now, again, it now becomes completely spontaneous and effortless, slipping in and out of meditation, and the quality of experience is one of perfection. And again here, the thoughts, of course, very still here, using a different analogy, that our mind is completely immovable, like this Mount Meru, king of mountains. So these are the 9 stages, and this is sort of the correlation we see, rough correlation between the 9-stage model and the 4, or here it's actually 5-stage model. Any questions about that chart? Yeah.
What is complacency?
Complacency means, what's the word for complacency? Complacency means where to be complacent about something is not to be a bit not lazy.
Relaxed about it.
Bit
Relaxed.
Relaxed? No, yeah, but
You know,
complacent.
I don't care enough.
Yeah, complacent means when we're sort of a little bit, not so much complacent.
Indifferent?
Huh?
Like indifferent?
Indifferent? Not quite.
Like you can't be bothered.
Yeah, complacent means you're sort of doing it, but you're not 100% enthusiastic. You're sort of like, okay, that's enough, sort of thing. So complacent sort of means that. Because at stage 4, our practice is going well, so it's easy to think, oh yeah, I'm sort of there now. I'm there. It's okay. That's complacency. We need to still improve.
How could one gauge where he's at?
I think at the initial stages it's not so difficult. I mean, if we're hardly on the object and we're distracted most of the time, then we're sort of around about stage 1. And again, then if we can normally we can focus maybe like I said, a minute or two. We can focus a bit longer, but we still get distracted a lot. That's stage 2. Stage 3 is really when we're most of the time on the object. We hardly get distracted, and if we do, we quickly come back. And then at stage 4, we never ever completely lose the object. There's still a lot of, not the quality's missing a lot, but we can focus on the object the entire session without ever completely losing it. The stages above that, I think, because at those stages, when you get there, your mind is much more refined, and you can pick that up. But I think there, often it's very helpful to get the guidance of a qualified teacher who's gone through that to note where you are. In fact, there was one very well-known meditator some years ago, Westerner, who had done a lot of work on Shamatha, but he wasn't sure, so he asked a couple of qualified Tibetan teachers, and they said basically he was at like about stage 6 or 7. So he wasn't himself quite sure. I mean, he probably knew he was above 4, but he didn't really know where he was in that. And that's based on his reports to them. That's what they said to him.
The reason I ask, the only meditation I can engage is one we're concentrating on the breath, because all the rest of the meditations have something to deal with thought.
Exactly.
So when the thought happens, I'm 100% with the thought.
Exactly. That's why this is the model used for the breath, and for the mind practice, we don't normally use this model.
Okay.
That's why we have that 4-stage model. Is there like a waterfall of thoughts, or is the amount of thoughts now starting to slow down a little bit? And is there more and more gaps between when one thought finishes and the next thought starts? That's the sign that the mind practice is moving forward. And then, of course, eventually the mind becomes completely still. So that's the model used more for the mind. So yeah, I mean, for that practice, you can use this model, but maybe it's a bit more difficult to correlate.
About our everyday shamatha after the retreat,
Yeah.
do you recommend to choose one kind, like breathing or whatever? Or
What we've seen is that each of these 3 objects we've used, the breath, the mind, and awareness, each has unique side benefits. I mean, each one of them is for shamatha, of course. And I think each one of those can be very helpful for most of us in the modern world, in meditation and in daily life. So it would be good to learn each one of these and be sort of competent in each one, so that we can take advantage of the side benefits of each one in daily life. So that means we could spend a bit of time on each one working on that. But then if we really want to dedicate a quite amount of time to really go much deeper in the shamatha, then it's probably best to pick one of those. But if we're just doing enough to sort of calm the mind a little bit, a little bit of daily practice in that, then it would be probably good to do all 3. So maybe you would spend then like a month or 2 using the breath every day to get familiar with it, to get into it, and then maybe the same with the mind, a month or 2 every day to get into it. So that then we can, with the mind, then we can sort of start to bring that into daily life, to start to observe our thoughts and emotions in daily life and not get caught up. And then again, about a month or 2 maybe of resting in awareness, so that in daily life we can have this more open, spacious mind than the constricted mind. So I think that can be useful.
How is it to in one session of 1 hour, for example, to go through like each 10 minutes to change, like from the birth.
The question is if you're doing 1 hour shamatha meditation practice?
Yes, to 1 hour, 45 minutes to go through all the objects.
In a shamatha practice, that's probably not the best strategy. I mean, of course, if you're doing 45-minute daily practice, you might want to do 15 minutes or 30 minutes shamatha and then the last half
Okay.
compassion or vipassana.